Obviously, there are a lot of myths in martial arts that happens so often. There's Chinese kung fu and everything looks so fancy in the movie until in reality it looks completely different. And some people just don't have the understanding of where is that line. I'm sure that this is the same with sword work. Like, first thing that comes to my mind, like Game of Thrones, Braveheart, whatever, all these things. Where is that line? So how realistic do movies, TV shows get?
It's very hard to draw the line because when you're talking about movies and TV shows, they are there to tell a story.
Right.
So, for example, if we look at Rob Roy and The Duelist, both choreographed by a guy called William Hobbs, he was doing these things in the late 70s, 80s. I think Rob Roy was 95. Duelists was 1977. There was a nascent revival in the interest in European arts at that time. If you take, for example, the beginning duel in The Duelist, it's what we call a small sword duel. Now, a small sword is generally a thrust-only weapon. It was worn as part of a gentleman's outfit, just for walking around. And it was principally a weapon for the duel in a civilian context. It's not generally something that you take to war. The duel there was ace because it was all point on line. It ended in a way that was realistic from what we know of accounts at the time. But a small sword is essentially like sports foil today. So we can have overlap and we can have a lineage of practice, even though it's not quite the same as it used to be, because we're not actually stabbing each other. We have a lineage of practice going back to that time, so we know with reasonable accuracy what something like that would look like. The further you go back in history, the greater the gap is. And the myths that build around those things become even greater. The thing that generally bugs me is not necessarily the sword play, because the sword play has to characterise that person as well as show some form of martial skill. If we take Rob Roy as an example, the final fight in Rob Roy, the British antagonist, whose name momentarily escapes me, is excellent with the transitional rapier of a time, which is both a cut and a thrust weapon in the case of the film, and he's lightning quick, he's very online, he moves excellently. Whereas Rob Roy, he picks up the basket hilt. Even though he swirls it around with speed, it is insinuated that it immediately is a lot heavier weapon that moves a little bit slower. Now, swords being the way they are, there's hundreds of thousands of swords out there, and not millions, and millions of different types of swords that are put together that look very similar but handle amazingly differently. For example, the two sabres we were fencing with there, one weighs about 800 grams, the other weighs about 950. The balance points are different, the grips are different. Even though to the untrained moviegoer's eye, they look the same, they handle vastly differently. And stuff like that doesn't get brought over in the movies. I mean, you can look at Pirates of the Caribbean when he goes, here's this lovely sword, and the tang is the full width of the blade, and the cinema audience are like, oh, that's amazing, I have no idea what it means, but it must be special. And everybody's there going, yeah, you want something like that, because it makes the blade strong. Well, I mean, if you gave me a little stupid rat tail tang, I'd tell you to take it back and make me a new one. So, there's these things about filmmakers putting technical language in, and various other bits and pieces. But then again, you also get what happens with wounding, because there's always this thing, right? So it's like the red shirts out of Star Trek or the soldiers of Gondor in Lord of the Rings. It doesn't matter how much high-tech stuff they've got or how much shiny plate armour they have, they are going to die if I do that to them when I am a hero. And that's something that you find frustrating, certainly in Lord of the Rings. See, plate armour, you can't cut through it, unless it's stupidly thin, stupidly badly made, and all the rest of it. Let's take Gondor for example. They weren't invested in all that plate armour just to look shiny. It should have served some purpose. So when somebody comes in and goes bang and just hits them with the lousiest cut across the middle and they fall over and they're dead, you're like, seriously, come on. But then again, you don't have time to do the perfect armoured duel or the perfect armoured fight. So, yes, there are myths. There are myths about the weight of weapons, usually that they're majorly overly heavy. Like the knightly longsword. Dude, that weighed 15 pounds. Rubbish. They go everywhere. There is a hand-and-a-half sword in the army of Alexandria that is 1 pound 8 ounces. You get knightly longswords that weigh close to 4 pounds. But outside of that are massive outliers. Anywhere in there's fine. but you get ridiculous, knights having to be winched onto their horses. Why would they do that? It makes no logical sense.
Yeah.
Okay, and we already know from weighing battle armour at the time, you could, and there's a video out there of a guy called Daniel Jacquet, he can do cartwheels, handstands, everything in a full suit of armour. He runs, army assault courses and things like that in a full suit of armour, because it's doable, because armour had to protect, but it also had to be relatively light and relatively manoeuvrable, otherwise what's the point in fighting in it? I mean, one of the gentlemen here today has already pointed out when he served in the army, he had to wear Kevlar front and back, and that was, although it protected you, yes, it took far too much away from your manoeuvrability and your ability to walk for long periods of time. So why bother wearing it? And it's not like you generally, in some cases, yes, you wore armour for a lot of time, but you didn't wear it all day, every day. I mean, there'd be times when you took it off. There's all these myths and things like that, which, when thoroughly researched, are proven to be false. But film and television, although they're getting better, I would, in a general sense, say, there's still some stuff out there that makes you really just want to throw something at the television.
Like, if you would have to say one show or one movie where it's better than most in replicating what really would have happened, what would that be? See,
that's really tricky. There's always parts of ones that you would say are pretty decent. But it's mostly on things that are on mass. So like a well-choreographed one, like the Duelist that I mentioned, generally the fights in those are pretty damn good and pretty realistic, with the caveat that often they are trying to characterise their fighters. Characterise their character and show that the way that they fight is their character. So I really like that. Like modern things like Game of Thrones, I was talking about with another gentleman here about, when certain things you just have to leave your martial training or things that you know at the door. Because it's fantasy, it has a huge amount of leeway. So I don't care if it breaks the laws of physics, I'm good with that because it's a fantasy film.
Sure.
And I can whinge about sometimes those things, it's the characterisation that annoys me. So, for example, there was the fight. I can't remember the two between the
mountain and how's the guy? Anyone?
The one who gets his head turned into a very
it's
flat
a cool guy,
grapefruit.
but but I don't remember either.
That one.
Right.
Previous in the series, the mountain had been flinging around a two-handed sword like nobody's business, and had been, hey, he looks like a really good fighter. He can move a big sword, even though it's not as heavy as people think it is. He can move a big sword very fast and very, very well. Then it comes to the duel against this guy, and you're like, he's just swinging it around like it's a 10-ton lead bar. Why the change in characterisation? And it's stuff like that slightly grinds my gears a little bit.
Right.
But,
you definitely noticed those
that,
things.
Yeah, I mean, you look at things like Sharp with Sean Bean that got me involved in this. It's like the only thing he's ever survived on television or
wow,
film. Yeah, exactly.
Sean Bean.
That's how good that character was. His fight, he can't fence for toffee, but it characterises his ability very well because he was never taught to fence. He was given a 1796 heavy cavalry sabre by his officer, there you go, you're leading the men now, good luck. And he fights with it like an untrained fighter would fight. So I can forgive them that.
Right.
I'm not expecting him to go out and do, perfect wrist-cutting Moulinets with that sword just because. I can forgive the fact that he doesn't fence well.
Good.
So it's about characterisation. What do you want to do with the character? If you portray somebody as a really decent martial artist, make them look like one, though. I think that's the biggest thing that most martial artists would say is the biggest bugbear, is they watch something and they say, oh, this guy's a really good fighter, and this, that, and the other, and you're just watching it like, no. You need to do better.